Greetings and welcome to this open online briefings offered by FOREST-D. We will start in a few minutes. We are waiting for David Nabarro to connect. But welcome and greetings, Karen, greetings, Annie and Keith, Nigel, Michael, Quinn Patton, greetings to you. Greetings, Zenda, Joe Nichols. Very, very pleased to see you here. Let me chase David so that he's connecting. Hello, David.
Excellent, very good. Lovely to see everybody. Very special collection of people. Thank you very much indeed for being here. Over to you, Flo. Thank you.
Well, I welcome everybody to this open online briefing, indeed offered by FOREST-D. So we are together for 1 hour. And we will start with David Nabarro sharing with us his perspectives on a number of issues. I think, David, today you wanted to talk to us about COP28, the climate COP that is starting soon in Dubai. And you also wanted to share with the group how you are working together with TRI and with other colleagues to develop a toolkit on living systems leadership for development practitioners. But you said to me before the call, emphasize that I want this to be tuned into the geopolitics of now and the challenges of the world as it is now. So that made even me curious to hear more about your project. So David will talk to us during about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the conversation for your own comments, questions possible, or little vignettes on what you are doing regarding leadership, changing systems and advancing a world towards a world, that is more equitable and sustainable. David, with this introduction, do you want to pick it up from there?
Thanks. First of all, actually, each time we run one of these briefings, we never quite know who's going to join. And I'd like to celebrate the particular group that's here today. And so starting, and I would like to greet you individually, those that I know, that is. There are one or two here that I know less well. So first of all, Annie Feltham, thank you again for joining us. I know that your particular focus is the geopolitics of now, looked at through a UK lens. Thank you for that. Annie and Keith Appleyard, my sister and her husband, it's just lovely to be with you again today. Nigel Lloyd, who I've worked with for decades, and we know that he's currently involved in numerous projects, but particularly how you actually assess performance of people who go through trainings in complexity. But Nigel Lloyd, at least in the way in which your brain works, in my judgment, you're quite similar to Michael Quinn Patton, who has, in my view, one of the best capacities to synthesize activities in the social sectors, especially when there are multiple actors involved in trying to deal with extreme complexity. And we work together on that in relation to the work he does in Blue Marble evaluation and his assessment of how different actors work together on the Food System Summit 2021. And it was lost her now, Zenda Ophir, who introduced us to Michael Quinn Patton, and what an introduction that was. And Zelda is a professional evaluator, but is interested in how you evaluate systems leadership as opposed to conventional linear leadership. Jane Badham joins us from her practice, I suspect, in South Africa. Joe Nichols is doing amazing development work, particularly focused on Somalia, out of Nairobi. And that's beautiful. Rebecca Cantor introduced me to the politics of food and the work she's doing on that out of Chile. And she's still, I believe, working in Chile. whilst Ad Spikers, who's labelled administrator, introduced me to the politics of food in Bangladesh, but is joining us from Vietnam. Denise Van Bissen is joining us again as a systems thinker from Nicaragua. I don't know where Michelle Eisminger is at the moment, but Chris Langton is a systems leader and a systems analyst of extraordinary capacity, who's a bit like Michael Quinn Patton, working across multiple domains. Iman Ahmed and I met each other because she's part of the Somali diaspora, living and working in Canada, but periodically she goes and does things for WHO. She was recently in Gaziantep when the Syrian earthquake hit, which also affected southern Turkey, and she survived and is doing well, but that was a most extraordinary episode. Claire Rayner is one of a community who join us, who's been working on long COVID and herself has had some struggles with COVID, but it was through Claire that we met a whole brilliant group who are active in that area. And Miles Breeden is somebody with whom I've been closely engaged, as he himself, as a development worker, went through some quite complicated illness experiences a couple of years ago. Anyway, this is just showing you what an eclectic mix it is. I wanted to start by just saying that, yes, we're still working on COVID and in a variety of different settings, but I have radically reduced the amount of my own involvement in it because my colleagues in WHO have had to morph to doing other things. But you probably, many of you realize that there is one of these slightly worrying things occurring. There are reports of pneumonia of unknown origin that appears, however, to be infectious, that's occurring among children in northern China, and that's led to big queues in outpatient departments. It's not associated at the moment with high fatalities, but I was last night in discussion with colleagues in WHO about how we're going to approach this, especially as the issue of unknown infection emerging in China affecting children is something that has immediately caught the eye of a number of journalists who like a good story. So they're just to say that these things don't go away, and it's recycling in challenging ways. We don't think that this unknown etiology pneumonia in China is related to COVID and the coronavirus that causes it, but let's wait and see how that evolves. So there's not going to be a lot of discussion on acute infection associated with COVID. However, long COVID and various forms of long-term disability that are associated with infection with COVID and attempts to understand the etiology of this is going to feature in our next open online briefing, and Twee will give the full details of that. And we've arranged that some of the people who've joined these briefings to talk about the etiology of long COVID, particularly cardiologist Dr. Ray Duncan, will join us at the next one in order to try to give us a little bit of help on working this one through. It's not straightforward, and I think we will all find it a particularly rewarding thing to be discussing. Twee and I will tell you the date and time of our next session before we finish this one. I'd like now to shift to really climate and the whole process through which governments come together to negotiate action on climate change, and what we expect to be happening in the forthcoming meeting that organized by UAE in Dubai, starting on the 30th of May, with a particularly high-level segment called the World Climate Action Summit, when government leaders come along and not only talk publicly about what they're doing, but also focus on what they can do together. That's going to be at the beginning of December in Dubai. There will be quite a long tail to the meeting in Dubai. It's called the Meeting of the Parties to discuss action on climate change. It's an annual event, and it's got a long tail to it this time because there's a serious attempt by the UN and by the hosts, who are the United Arab Emirates government, to go into detail on a number of technical areas that need attention of government leaders. Now, a lot of people have said that they feel that a negotiation about climate taking place in United Arab Emirates is a big mistake. And I wanted just to spend a moment or two. I've got three big themes, and my first theme is going to be who should be leading these kinds of negotiations and where. There is a thesis that people who have a vested interest in aspects of the future, particularly when it comes to climate, should be excluded from negotiations about climate. And that includes the suggestion that the executives from companies that are involved in the extraction of fossil fuels like oil, natural gas, and coal, that they should be excluded from discussions about how the world will live with a reduced dependency on these kinds of energy sources, because those are the energy sources that contribute directly to global warming. Now, I want to say that it is my personal belief, based on what I've been doing over the last 30 or 40 years, that when you're dealing with a difficult issue, you should not exclude anybody who's got a vested interest in it from the conversation. You have to be able to have the uncomfortable conversations with people you don't agree with. Otherwise, you are reducing your opportunity to be able to find a negotiated way of moving forward. Now, there'll be people who turn around to me and say that I'm talking rubbish, because they'll say, if you have the fossil fuel industry in some way engaged in negotiations about the future of greenhouse gas emissions, because they're powerful and because they are very good at deception, they will actually bias the negotiation process. So for a negotiation to be pure, they should not be present. And that same community has also been quite public in saying that a country like the United Arab Emirates, whose economy is heavily dependent on fossil fuel extraction, should not be hosting the 28th Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. Well, I've spoken to ministers from the UAE government quite recently, actually, in London this week. And I asked one particular minister, what did they think about the suggestion that a guy called Sultan, who is the head of the UAE National Oil Company, should be prevented from being the president of this year's climate COP. And my informant said to me, that of course is a point of view that we understand. And we believe it's perfectly okay for advocates to say that they don't want UAE to be leading a climate COP, and they don't want the president of our oil company to be president of the COP. But my informant said that if an oil exporting country is given the responsibility, that really quite massive responsibility, for presiding over the negotiations about the future, then that puts an immediate responsibility on both the president of the COP and the country that is hosting the COP to take seriously the outcomes of the negotiations. And if that includes phasing out oil and gas in a particular way by a particular time, it's all the more important that we're there and part of the negotiations and seen to be owning the outcome, because that then will make clear that we take responsibility for applying it to ourselves. Now, that's come from somebody I trust who works in the UAE government at senior level. And so I go to Dubai very much with an open mind about the fact that that it is an oil exporting company that's running this year's COP, knowing that there are a number of world leaders, like, for example, Al Gore, who've come out very publicly criticizing. Also, some international human rights leaders and others have come out the same with criticisms. And so it'll be very interesting to see how that political issue plays through. In my summary of it is UAE as host, yes or no? Is that something that we ought to take a view on? Secondly, what happens inside a COP? Last week, I was with a senior international figure. The results of the Argentine elections had just come through. The senior international figure turned around to me and said to me, you know, when we get things like this happening with a country lurching suddenly to the right, and then I got a text from the same person saying, what did I think of the results of the election in the Netherlands? Again, a lurch to the right. How do we, as people who are committed to activities that can only be taken forward by governments working together with common purpose, how do we react when populist, somewhat libertarian people become leaders of countries, and we know that they are going to be actively working against multilateral engagement? How do we react to that? What will we do if President Trump wins the US election next year? How will we react to that? And I've been thinking very hard about this. Do we give up any hope for multilateral negotiations that are based on agreements between heads of state and government? Do we say that that process of trying to plot the future path for the world is flawed because it can be captured and derailed by libertarian or right-wing leaders when they come into power, who will publicly state that they don't wish to act in concert with others on existential issues like climate change, or indeed like damage to nature and so on? And I don't have a simple answer to it, but I am very, very keen indeed, at least in my own practice, not to depart from having faith in the process through which national leaders emerge, and faith in the process through which we rely on national leaders to negotiate a future that is equitable and sustainable for all. Just in the last few hours, I had a question that came to me indirectly from the leader of a country in Africa where there's recently been a military coup. And I was asked, are leaders of countries that have been put in place as a result of military coups going to be welcome at the UN Climate COP28 starting in Dubai next week? And it's quite an interesting question, because some of these leaders who've come to power through coups are not necessarily recognized by the United Nations, yet they are leaders. But is there any difference fundamentally between leaders who emerge as a result of tussles through decisions in the ballot box and then various electoral college votes or coalition negotiations that go on that eventually lead to the anointing of a leader? Are they necessarily radically different in style from situations where leaders have come to power as a result of a coup by a military force that believes it's acting in the public interest. I don't have an answer to it, but I think it's a very interesting debating point as to whether or not there is enough kind of leadership, education and grooming for the right kind of leaders to emerge, to be entrusted with charting the pathway towards a future world. And what do we do about the fact that, at least in many countries, the leadership is definitely becoming more insular and more reflective of the sort of climate change denier tendency? And my third point is, what happens if the negotiations get so bogged down that they miss out on the things that really matter? So, for example, in the climate conversations, the negotiations have for a long time been about trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in energy generation, and to shift towards energy generation that does not lead to the net production of these gases, including methane, carbon dioxide, and more. Okay, that's the thrust that it's going in. But then, have they perhaps missed the point? What we're seeing right now is that climate change is messing up the lives and livelihoods of people in countries with an overall population of at least 1 billion. That's about 1/8 of the world's population having their lives damaged as a result of climate change. You see it mostly among the farmers. And the farmers are saying more and more that they're finding it either difficult or very difficult to practice their farming because of uncertainties about precipitation and because of damage, often as a result of extreme floods and other weather calamities. So perhaps the climate discussions have been so focused on what we call mitigation, reducing emissions, that they haven't put enough attention to adaptation. Is it time to try to change the balance of the negotiations? Well, to cut a long story short, I've been massively involved in the last 10 years in quite an intense process to try to influence climate change negotiations. That's in part been as a result of joining activities that have been organized by successive UN Secretaries General, who've tried to set up summit meetings, bringing together leaders to encourage them to be more ambitious and audacious on their climate goals, saying to listening, and I've been listening to particularly Antonio Guterres, saying to world leaders, it's not enough what you're doing at the moment. It's too pedestrian. You're basically not going to move quick enough at the current pace to get us towards the kind of decarbonization that is necessary to prevent there being much, much greater suffering in the world as a result of climate change. So he has, this current Secretary General, been very outspoken in trying to get greater ambition through directly appealing to world leaders and trying to establish coalitions of ambitious world leaders who are ready to set the example for others. I've also been involved in many activities involving civil society, some of which have been most definitely geared to inspiring civil society actors to become more active on climate change. I've been advising philanthropic organizations that give grants to civil society organizations working on climate. I've also been involved with groups that have been trying to change the nature of the conversation. For example, 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions in the world today come from activities around food and the use of land and agriculture. And so I've been involved with a community that is trying to bring food and agriculture into climate discussions, even though the negotiators don't want to touch it, even though the politics of food are really difficult, because there are some countries that actually are economically dependent on exporting vast amounts of food, including livestock products, as well as grain and pulses. And they don't particularly want to see food and agriculture entering into climate negotiations. It's a very delicate issue. But I take the view that if 1/3 of emissions are associated with food and agriculture, and if agriculture and farming all over the world is being damaged by climate change, it's really important that we bring food into climate discussions. So this year, Florence and I are going to go to Dubai to COP28, and we've got two big remits. One is to try to bring food more into the agriculture discussions. We'll be participating in food events at the very beginning of the COP on December the 1st, where we're trying to get a big sign-on activity underway involving between 70 and 100 heads of government, all endorsing a declaration that says they're going to bring food into their agriculture discussions. And then we will be working with countries to encourage food and agriculture to converge as issues that need to be dealt with together. And then secondly, we're also going to be working in the health part of this year's COP because of some work that I'm responsible for at Imperial College, trying to understand the mental health and emotional consequences of the climate emergency for different communities around the world, and ways in which those consequences can be ameliorated in practice. So that's just to say that we are going to UAE, acknowledging that there are some questions about UAE in leadership. We're going to a climate COP where there's going to be a real difficulty in getting convergence and coherence because of the big geopolitical splits in today's world, and some of which I just briefly referred to. And thirdly, our job is to try to bring food more centrally into the climate discussions. All this kind of work, as far as we're concerned, only can succeed if we practice systems leadership. And in the discussion today, as in discussions in future briefings that we do like this, we always want to be reflecting on why systems leadership is so essential when dealing with these really difficult issues. Flo, that's my introduction. I stop now and I look forward to the conversation. By the way, my specific question that I would really like you all to focus on is just simply, what are your hopes for this year's climate negotiations in in Dubai? British people will be interested to know that one of the principal speakers at the very beginning, after the President of the UAE and the Secretary General of the United Nations, is the King of England. And so that might be of interest for British thing. But what are your expectations and any thoughts you've got about how people like us need to be thinking and behaving when we are in Dubai? It won't be a party.
No, not expecting a party, really. Thank you very much, David. Colleagues, if you want to join, raise your points, questions, attract my attention as Annie just done. So Annie, you will be the first one kicking our round for today. Annie Feldham, please.
Thanks. I'm going to try I'm sort of trying to get this thought out clearly, and I want to go back to what we talked about, the geopolitical thing and what we've learned from COVID. And so I think it does matter how leaders get appointed to their position. And that's because what we can see from COVID is that such a big event is consistent with how that system works. They're not outliers. And so we could look, we could look at the UK, but if I was thinking about Russia, for instance, which I know very well, their political responses reflect how they see the world, and so there's a consistency, certainly here and in Russia. If you look at health or prisons or inequality, and so how the system works, it is reflected all the way through, and so I think it matters very much about how those leaders got there, and what, for instance, in COP we do with putting it in those they're not just oil dependent, they're oil leaders. And if we look, for instance, back to what happened in the States even 30 or 40 years ago, when the leaders of the oil industry then hid what they knew about what the damage oil would do to all of us. I think it's really difficult, and it comes back to, in quite a crude way, how power is gained and implemented. And for me, that's the same whether it's in my own country or somewhere else. And so I do get what you're saying, David. I just am very suspicious. And what's made me more suspicious is the consistency of how systems work, which is what we've learned from different countries' response to COVID, and how it just isn't an outlier, and and it was something that you said a long time ago, was that the dangers of inequality and what that did to people's life chances, and that's become even more ingrained in the UK and in other places like Russia. So I'm delighted that we've got this wider horizon now. But you'd expect me to say that, wouldn't you, as a social developer, governance sort of person? But I am fairly gloomy about some of this, just because of the geopolitics and the absolutely ghastly things that are happening in various places of the world. I hope that's come out sensibly, because it's a thought that isn't terribly sort of polished in my own head. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine.
Go for it, David.
So I just want to say, okay, we need to accept that the context is gloomy, but I want us as a group to experiment with saying, despite the fact it's gloomy, we can't walk away.
No, and I'm happy to join in that experiment.
People like myself, at least, who've got a chance to play inside these processes, even if I'm totally gloomy, don't feel like getting up and going off to an event or getting to a meeting or something, I still feel I have to do it. It's kind of a duty. Secondly, the geopolitics are as bad as they've been in my professional life. And so we have to kind of work inside that. And then thirdly, as you say, we kind of get what we deserve, if you see what I mean, because the systems create a particular style of leader emerging. Despite all that, I'm kind of saying to all of you, we still have to do it. Are there clever ways in which we can do it? Are there ways in which we can anticipate and encourage the emergence of new stuff in the systems language? And what's lovely, Annie, is that you come and you join us for most of these events. And even though your politics sometimes understandably takes you into a corner. You're also a very practical person. I've known that for decades, having worked with you, and you try taking advantage of the fact that you understand about power relations in a particular way, you try to still contribute. And so thank you at least for playing the experiment, for playing your part in the experiment, and let's keep thinking about it. So despite the gloom, despite the geopolitics, despite the bizarre way in which leaders often emerge, we can still, as a group, keep trying for better processes to come. And thank you for that. I'll be quiet and hope that we will now build a conversation from that. Florence, I'm not going to come in now unless you tell me to, but there are people, I can see their faces, that I think with a bit of tickling might also contribute.
Absolutely, and actually Jane Badham would like to contribute beyond the chat. Jane, lovely to see you. The floor is yours.
Lovely to be with all of you again. And I'm just slightly changing from where Annie was going, but it's linked to your nutrition issue, is that I've written it in the chat boxes. What we're finding in our work with the low middle income countries is that they're sitting with this kind of double-edged sword or double trouble, because in order to address the micronutrient malnutrition that they have and some of the malnutrition issues, they actually need to be changing diets in a way that might in fact have a slight increase in their carbon emissions. And at the same time, these governments are really being pushed to reduce their carbon emissions. And so a lot of them are finding this real difficulty because, for example, to address iron deficiency anemia, although you can fortify, you might have to have people eating more of the kind of animal source foods, which add to the carbon emissions. So I think people need to be aware of this double trouble and difficulty that some of these low middle income countries have in trying to reach the SDGs and ending malnutrition in all its forms, but at the same time being pushed to reduce their carbon emissions, even though, to be honest, perhaps the high income countries should be doing more of that than forcing it on the low middle income countries. And I think that's an important thing that I'd like to just put in your mind as you head off.
Yeah. Gosh.
Then the impossible equations here in our team, Jane. But yes, and there seems to be even more impossible as we add layers. I mean, climate coming on top of the nutrition equation, which is already a very, very complex one. Yeah, David, more comments before.
Yeah, sorry.
Chris,
absolutely beautiful one from Jane, because about 2 years ago, a research group based in Oslo, but it's an international group, produced a book called Eat, Planet, Health, which was designed to encourage people to shift the way they eat so that it is better for the planet. And that included much, much, much less meat. And inevitably, that's caused quite a lot of trouble. The real trouble came because the prescription in this report was to eat less meat overall, but actually the report presentation did not discriminate between communities, for example, like in Ethiopia, where frankly they ought to eat more meat if they're going to get their micronutrient intake that's required, versus communities in North America who actually eat rather a lot more meat than they need to from any nutritional standpoint. So clumsy prescriptions that do not take account of variations between different communities have to be avoided in this kind of work. And by having clumsy global prescriptions coming from many within the climate community, we may have collectively stirred up more opposition than we need to have. So in response to Jane Badham's point, I think many of us particularly working on food in relation to emissions and also in relation to adaptation, realize that we need to be much, much more punctate and locally sensitive with anything we say, listen and adapt rather than prescribe. That again fits in with the living systems approach that says that every system must be adapting to its environment if it's going to be useful. If one tries to prescribe for a global message, it's almost always going to be wrong.
Thank you for this exchange, Jane and David. I would like to turn to Chris Langdon before inviting Dr. Iman Ahmed. Chris, please.
Thank you, Florence. I think Rebecca's got it just right in the chat, saying we have to live for the future in a polycrisis. I mean, I can't really guide you on what's going to happen at COP because I'm not going. I think it's fantastic the various initiatives you're doing, and clearly not just the geopolitics, but with the super El Nino. And I think next year is a huge number of elections, not just in the US, UK, South Africa, India, etc. So it's really going to be quite an important year, both between this and the next COP and other COPs going forward. What I think is exciting, to pick up your theme, David, are the number of people thinking about ways of generating social change, perhaps thinking maybe the current models are not correct. Yesterday, Aviva brought out a report on tipping points in finance. It's undercooked, frankly, but it's part of an intent to think very strategically and using systemic thinking. Then I've been working quite closely with the University of Exeter. They have a global tipping points report coming out, coinciding with COP on the 6th, which is not just looking at the climate tipping points, which will be more and more gloomy, but looking very much at the focused social tipping points, or if you like, Donatella Meadows, the leverage points. And I think those sort of conversations, as they develop more and more, are really where the action has to be. And we do, as Rebecca has said, we need to be very resilient in what's going to be a very troubling year. And I think by developing these techniques and being honest whether some of what we've been doing so far isn't effective. And I was due to go to an event that Roger Hallam was due to do yesterday, but unfortunately he was unwell. And he's looking at something that I think is very familiar to all these briefings during the last 2 years. He was going to tell us how we need to focus on the dynamics of small group sociability, which he believes turns out to be the key space where pro-social human motivation and collective action are created. Illness prevented him from delivering his thoughts yesterday, and it will be a closed-door group, but this has been on the internet, what he's going to say. But again, even thinkers like him are just trying to think about some of the aligned with the sort of processes we've been discussing both today and in the past about generating positive change in times of adversity.
Very interesting, Chris. Thank you for this. I'm curious your reaction, David.
Absolutely. I mean, the world will evolve along multiple levels, but I basically now, and Chris has helped me, see two very distinct levels. There's the political leader level, and there is what really happens in real life level. And most of what really happens in real life is about small groups and how they function. I think where I am constantly getting stuck is that small group working isn't enough. When we've got something like COVID coming along and we've got a vaccine that works, but it's not available in large volume, if a small number of wealthy countries capture the stock of COVID vaccine for the best part of a year, which is associated with a lot of unhappiness and misery and death in poorer countries, that is showing that there is still the capacity of the clique of leaders to cause real misery for people in their small groups. So I am now very keen on the interface between the small group working and the political leader working, which is where I really want to continue. Doesn't mean that I've found any solution, by the way. I don't see how small groups working can reduce some of the killing wars that are going on. We are having to cope with the license for a small number of people to cause incredible harm. And we know about that. We talked about it in the last session. So I'm super interested in continuing to work in an enlightened, intellectually sound and human way on the connection between the leader and the small group. And please, Chris, keep twisting our arms to go on thinking about that.
Thank you, Chris and David, for this exchange. I would like to invite Dr. Iman Ahmed. If you hear me, yes, you do.
Hi, thank you very much. And you can call me Iman, sorry, that's for other meetings. I just should have adjusted my name. Thank you, David. I would like to reflect on a couple points and bring in a few others. First of all, I think I do agree with you that demonizing some actors does not help, and we ought to be inclusive. Even though the UAE is a big oil, it has large oil reserves. When we look at the list of the big polluters, only in the oil production, it ranks number 8, while the USA takes number 1 on all this, on all fronts, on fossil fuels, on oil, and on gas. Canada, my home country, is number 4 in terms of being the big polluters. So I think the narrative itself makes a big sense in how we look at it and how we frame it. Another issue I wish to bring is there are concerns around the possibility of greenwashing of oil and gas production at COP28.
Yeah.
I'll bring an example to that. I recently received one of the emails from the Sustainable Innovation Forum around a panel that will be held prior to ahead of COP28. And one of the speakers is the Honorable Premier of Alberta in Canada. Oh, yes. Alberta is the top polluter in Canada. The Premier is taking Canada to court, taking the federal government to court over over curbing the production of oil and pollution being happening, because she believes that this is her major source of income for the province and so on. So that's who is going to be speaking. So I think this is something to be for people to be watching for. I will add to that also the New Humanitarian has recently held a forum, panel discussion, and I put the link, and it brings quite interesting points around carbon tax and how useless these are, around even terminology like net zero and so on used by the UN. So it's a very insightful discussion and an eye-opener in my opinion. Moving on to the point you raised on food, I really appreciate that you'll be engaging in this and you have been a pioneer in the area. I think one of the most important points to advocate for is a return to native crops. Yeah. If you take Africa, Africa has been gradually moved into being dependent on wheat and maize, and these are not native crops. And a country like India is now advocating for a return to millet. We have sorghum in Africa. We have a number of native crops. We have our cassavas and so on. So when the war broke out in Ukraine, the narrative, again, it's all about narratives. The narrative was Africa is going to starve because of the war on Ukraine. Why? Because the wheat cannot go to feed Somalia and so on. So I think a return to native crops, millet is so much, it consumes far less water. So the natural crops are more suited to the local environment. And if we can advocate for that, that's going to be a fantastic point. And finally, I'm part of an Africa group that works on, as part of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. We recently had a very fruitful meeting with the group from Latin America and the Caribbean. One of the cries coming out is we need to talk about climate in relation to displacement. And I think using systems thinking, climate, food, displacement are all related. And it would be important to link all of these. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't go long.
That was very, very interesting, Iman. So never too long. David, any reaction?
Just to say, I love it. Number one, narrative. It's all about narrative. you can't have a narrative if you don't involve everybody. Really, you end up with just a partial story. Number two, the greenwashing, it's everywhere. And part of the activity has to be extremely explicit about the importance of preventing that stuff going on. Don't want to go on about that now, but it's what we do. And thirdly, climate is going to become the major cause of displacement for hundreds of millions of people in coming years, especially if climate change accelerates as we anticipate. So it's really good that you highlight that. And it just shows, as a systems thinker, you just have to recognize that all the things that really matter these days are super interconnected. Iman Lovely, the president of Somalia, I don't know whether it's relevant to you, was with us on Monday this week.
Thank you, Iman and David. Let's turn to Joe Nichols. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think I'm both frozen in the image and also slightly croaky, so sorry for both of those. But to pick up on Iman's last point, I mean, in Somalia at the moment, we're seeing massive floods and entire towns which are in the breadbasket of Somalia underwater. And I mean, in the last few weeks, about 650,000 people have been displaced. And we're trying to find boats to literally rescue people who are trapped on newly formed islands. So the link between climate change and displacement is incontrovertible. It's being seen here on a daily basis. I mean, the other thing I wanted to go back to was the original question about COP28. I think one piece of work that I think the African countries put together in advance of the Africa Climate Summit was the need to reform the vertical climate funds. And whilst I understand the importance of building capacities, of setting up systems, of better accountability, of having kind of good processes that allow people to live up to the normal standards, I don't think that there's time to wait for that. It feels like these things are needed immediately, and we probably have to find a way of absorbing the risk of allowing countries to receive funding, even despite their challenges with managing it in a way that a much more developed country would manage it. So that would, I guess, be the ask of COP28, if we're allowed to define it like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. David, jump in.
Just so important that we recognize that on the one hand, there is an absolute need for money to get to poor countries, and there are blocks and constraints everywhere with all sorts of excuses being used. But at the same time, on the other hand, there is an absolute need for whatever money does move to be traceable, accountable, and all the rest, because right now, getting money out of the system is hard. Look, the World Food Programme at the moment, which acts as the global safety net, is running at 26% of normal income, and nobody quite knows why. Money is just drying up. So Joe, I just think that we have to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we do need to do everything possible to get these funds working so they get money to poor. Unfortunately, an absolute champion of this work, Salim al-Haq, who basically led the process of getting loss and damage funds agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. He went and died just a week ago, but in his memory, I think we've really got to work hard on getting this right.
Indeed, thank you so much. Let's turn to Rebecca Cantor. Thank you for what you were putting in the chat. I was reading with interest, but Rebecca, what would you like to emphasize?
Yeah, so as I put in the chat, I really think the new normal for this foreseeable future is polycrisis, or more than one crisis happening at once wherever we are in the world. And so we can't think of systems as just happening with only just one of these crises happening. I think that will mislead us into thinking about solutions that won't work as solutions. And so as I put in the chat, and you all can read later or download, I've come up with colleagues a number of questions to ask about how do we make systems, in this case food systems, but really could be applied to any system, more resilient. And it's important to, I really think, ask all these questions to understand why are we making these systems more resilient, and from whose perspective and from whose incentive to do that or not do that, and what are the trade-offs there when we're trying to talk to everyone. But what I want to say related to all this, in terms of a positive sort of strategy or tool or solution you could take to COP28, what I really think is needed in this new normal of polycrisis is greater digital literacy worldwide. It's almost as if we're trying to write new manuals or guides, but people don't know how to read. Literacy is low, so how can we say, follow this new manual or guide? You can apply that same logic or thinking to digital literacy. It's not enough that everyone in the world now has a smartphone, or in some countries like Chile, on average, there's more than one smartphone per person. We really need digital literacy, and increasing digital literacy will not just strengthen food systems, as I've started to do research on here in Chile, but will strengthen many other aspects of systems that cut across all these different polycrises that we're talking about. And we also had bad floods here a month or two ago, and I was just thinking about the same issue of digital literacy. Had there been more digital literacy, there probably would have been even greater solutions to help these people that were stranded or lost homes or lost their cropland when these floods happened. But that's just one example. We're in a new normal where we absolutely need greater digital literacy. Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. Very important point here. In the interest of time, I would like to go straight to Michael Quinn-Patton and invite you, Michael, to share your perspective with us. You're on mute, Michael.
Thank you, David and Florence Lasbennes, for sponsoring these important updates. I would just add two quick things from my experience working with people around evaluation and leadership. Is that one of the, I think, things that distorts things like COP meetings and these national negotiations is there is so much focus on what the recommendations are going to be that it ends up being a negotiation around recommendations, and that leaders spend very little time actually understanding the data or understanding what it means to think in systems terms or polycrisis terms. My ideal, which obviously wouldn't happen, David, but would be for a COP that banned recommendations and spent the entire time under your facilitation having dialogues about what the actual situation is, going deep into the data from a systems perspective without the agenda of coming up with recommendations. Get deep into the data. They don't do that. They don't understand the data, and they don't know how to think systemically, so they come up with bad recommendations.
Oops, a lot of applause, Michael, from several participants. David, pick it up from there, please.
It's great that both Michael QP and Zenda are on this call. I just saw a really quite interesting comment from Zenda in the chat as well. And I think if we build then on what Rebecca just said, what we're fundamentally, I think, saying to each other is that it's obvious that for the future, all of humanity needs to learn to be able to work with interdependent systems that look and feel different depending on the perspective of the viewer, i.e., they are not rigid systems in the mechanical sense, they are extremely soft systems in the human sense. They're soft, but they're vital, because everything important in life comes through human systems. So we therefore need, between ourselves, to be able to look each other in the eye and say, what skills do you need to be able to work with interconnected human systems, especially if you are trying to focus on the things that are really important for the survival of humanity on a livable planet for the next few generations? And the answer has to be that we've got to be extraordinarily skillful at taking advantage of this wonderful revolution in communications that is now with us, and that's the digital revolution. It doesn't mean having a smartphone and being able to look at videos on TikTok, or even having a smartphone and being able to do your emails and your chats instantaneously with people at the other side of the world. It means being digitally literate, what I feel Rebecca was getting at. And actually what Rebecca was saying to me when we were together at a meeting somewhere, I think it was in either The Hague or Utrecht or somewhere, The Hague, and I met you face to face, and we were talking about the need to be systems literate if you're going to be able to make sense of the world. So it's a kind of digital literacy to be able to work with systems that becomes necessary. And how do you get that? Through dialogue. You don't get it through going to lectures. You don't get it through looking at PowerPoints. You get it through learning to listen and to sense using all your senses. And that's what Michael's asking for, and what he really believes that needs to be happening in these kind of global meetings. People, I believe, are prevented from thinking in depth and with maturity because they get focused on needing to negotiate outcomes. So the outcome sentence becomes more important than the meaning behind the sentence, or the people behind the meaning behind the sentence, or the activities that to be done by the people behind the meaning in the sentence. It all becomes so abstracted that it is meaningless. And what becomes absolutely vital in these global conversations is to turn from meaningless abstraction to a focus on the meaning for people who hurt because they're being affected by when violence is used to resolve conflicts that should be resolved peacefully, or they're affected when awful decisions are made that lead to damage to climate systems, nature systems, and other systems that in turn lead to hardship. So I just think that this is a very useful point to finish this conversation. It's only and remember, the style with which we work, and more it's the case in FOREST-D, is that conversations, of course, are never terminated. It's just there is a pause, a particular segment is finished. We go on with our lives, we connect in lots of other directions. We have numerous interactions with people all over the world. We can gather back together again a month later and reflect more, sharing wisdom or just simply listening to the wisdom of others, but all the time saying that that's because we understand that to be effective as systems workers and systems leaders, we need to be good at connecting, good at exploring, good at understanding, good at dialogue, good at sensing, good at feeling, all those skills that enable us to deal with human-centered systems. I hope you've all found this fun. Back to Florence and others for closing. Sorry for going on a bit long.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you, David. I will only remind us all that our next call will be on the 15th of December, so after COP, likely to share our reflections, impressions on what will have happened over there and continuing the conversation that has been started today. Thank you for your engagement with us. We learn with you, we evolve with you. That's much appreciated. Thank you very much. Wishing you a very good rest of today, nice weekend, and see you maybe on December 15. Bye-bye for now.